Hello and welcome everybody. Today we're going to be ranking all of Survivalist weapons in our tier list, which includes every weapon in the game. That also includes the 4 new weapons that we got, 2 HRG and 2 DLC. One of them is Survivalist exclusive, which is the HRG Locust. So let's begin. I'm going to just run through these really quick because we have a lot of weapons to get through. First up, we got the Gore Shiv. This is Survivalist knife, and this one's going to go right into D tier. You're only really going to use it at the end or at the very start. It does work with Melee Expert, which is pretty nice, and Melee Expert is a really good skill on Survivalist. But if you want to run Melee Expert, usually you want to be running a dedicated melee weapon, not really the knife itself. At least that's usually how I run it. But if you are running Melee Specialist, it does get you a lot of value early on because you can just kill a bunch of small stuff really quickly. Then we've got all of our grenades to go through. So we have the High Explosive Grenade here, which is an okay grenade. I would probably put this one into B tier. It does decent damage as a short fuse. It does high explosive damage. It's good towards flesh pounds and quarter pounds. Not necessarily the best of the grenades that you get offered though. Frag grenades, I would also say, is B tier. They work better against crowds than the high explosives, and I tend not to use them very much because you do have better options. Medic grenades are S tier. They're just so good by themselves. They provide value for you, for your teammates. You can clear up small enemies with them too, so that's really nice, and you can't hurt yourselves with them. Molotovs, I'd probably say, is like C tier on Survivalist. They're honestly not that great. They do okay damage towards crowds and towards small things, not the best towards big things, and you can light yourself on fire really easily with them. It's really been nice since you haven't had to take these if you want to take the weapon harness with Survivalist. I do like that a lot. Nail bombs I would probably also say is maybe B tier. I don't think it's as useful on Survivalist just because there's better ways to stun enemies with Survivalist, mainly that you get flashbangs, and flashbangs are really good. Nail bombs have gotten better though over time. So I would say they're on the high end of B tier, low end of A tier, somewhere around there. They are a pretty consistent grenade, but I would much rather have flashbangs, and flashbangs I would probably put up into either A or S tier. They're one of the best grenades in the game. You can't hurt yourselves with them. You can stun things for a long period of time. They work really well against Scrakes and flesh pounds. All of that's really nice. So low end of S tier, high end of A tier. They're probably not as good as the medic grenades, but they are either the second or third best grenade in the game right now, outside of like cryos, which we don't have access to, weirdly enough. The 9mm pistol I'm also going to put into D tier. It's going to be a fallback weapon that you're just going to use with Survivalists. You don't really have much going for it. Now we've got all of our tier 1 weapons. Hopefully I've got them here. The AR-15 is also D tier. The AR-15 is just a weapon you don't want to start out with. 3-round burst or semi-auto is just not that great. Semi-auto is okay, but it doesn't scale incredibly well with upgrades considering your Survivalist and can use so much more stuff. You're stuck at the 20-round magazine capacity, which is a little bit awkward. It's just not a great weapon overall. Medic pistol is probably a solid A tier or S tier. It is the most weight-efficient medic weapon in the game and just one of the most efficient weapons in the game because it will pay for itself. You can start with it. It heals allies. So it's great if you want to take it early on. It's great if you just have an extra weight that you can throw this on, or even if you want to upgrade it because the medic pistol scales surprisingly well with upgrades. Shotgun is honestly okay. I'm going to put this one into B tier. If you like starting out with a shotgun, it's fine. It's not as good as it is on support, but it's a pretty decent option if you want to start out with it. Does decent damage, scales well with upgrades. Most of the shotguns are kind of like that, so there's not really a bad option there. Grenade pistol is probably a solid A tier. Very good weapon overall. It's great that you can start out with it because you can get extra value that way. Does decent damage, scales really well if you want to keep it with upgrades. You don't even need upgrades for it to clear up some of the bigger things, which is nice. So always a pretty good option there. Single 1858 I'm going to put into B tier too. This one is pretty nice to buy early on because it's super cheap. It's like the cheapest thing you can buy. You can pick off basically all the small Zeds and even the medium Zeds with this, and it works with either of your level 5 perks for your faster reloads because this counts as a gunslinger weapon and a sharpshooter weapon. So you're always going to have faster reloads with it. Very nice. I would highly recommend grabbing it, especially if you can just pick it up off the ground, hang out with it for a couple rounds and just get some value out of it. Dual 1858s are kind of okay. I would also put them into B tier. They don't weigh too much. They scale decently well with upgrades. They wouldn't be something that I would stick with though. It's just you can have better options than this later on. Krovol's okay. I'm going to put this into C tier. It's a decent melee weapon, but it's not really one that I would go for. It is cheap, which is nice. So if you just want a melee weapon for running around and blocking and parrying with, it can work there. And if you pick it up off the ground, it is just a bonus. So that's kind of nice. Cock and Burn is bottom of the D tier for Survivalist. You don't have floor fire with it, and the Cock and Burn scales horribly with upgrades, so it's just an all-around disappointing weapon. MP7 is probably one of the best starting weapons. I'd also put this one up into A tier. It is very good. It's very lightweight. It's very cheap. It has a red dot on it, holds 30 rounds, has no recoil, clears up small enemies really quick. you get a lot of value out of it, so it's a very nice weapon to take early on. It does kind of fall off later because its upgrades just don't scale incredibly well, though. Winchester is another like A or S tier weapon. Honestly, I think I'm just going to throw into low end S tier for Survivalist. It's really good. Having faster reloads with this, regardless of which level 5 you have, is nice. The Winchester does high damage by itself, really high damage with upgrades, and its upgrades don't make it weigh that much. So the Winchester is just an all-around solid weapon. Maybe it falls off later on, but starting out and even into like the mid waves, it's going to serve very well for you. And then we just kind of have a weird mishmash of weapons here because I didn't want to take the time of sorting all of them to tier 2 and 3 and everything. So let's just begin here with a single deagle. I'm going to put this one up into A tier. Very cost efficient, high damage, doesn't weigh very much, and only weighs 2, which is great. Katana is decent. I'd put this one up into B tier. Oddly enough, I switched places with these in the Berserker tier list, but I think there's more of a reason to buy the Katana with Survivalist than there is with Berserker, since you don't really have like heavy attacks that scale up. Your light attacks are pretty decent with the Katana. It's lightweight enough. It's cheap. So if you want a cheap option for blocking, parrying, and clearing up small enemies, the Katana is a pretty decent option. C4 is probably A tier. It's really good. It's nice to have on basically any class. Survivalist is no exception to that. It's very cheap. It's very lightweight. Does a lot of damage, really great for clearing up quarter pounds. Blunderbuss is probably like B tier. Every time I've used the Blunderbuss, I haven't been super into it with Survivalist. It's okay, I think it's better on demo and on support, but it's still a pretty decent option. It's a super fun option to use on Survivalist. The explosions are great, the shotgun's great, just kind of awkward for its pricing and for its weight. And then we have the Freeze Thrower. Freeze Thrower is probably another B tier weapon. It does decently well against most things. You can freeze larger enemies, which is great. You can freeze the smaller enemies. Any enemy that's frozen you don't have to worry about. And its secondary fire has the ice shotgun, which is kind of cool. Tommy gun is okay on Survivalist, but there's not really a reason to be taking it unless you just want to use it, because you could just go with like the MP7 and it's just a better option early on. So I'm going to put the Tommy gun in C tier. It's decent. Iron sights aren't really the best. Doesn't really scale well with upgrades because it gets kind of heavy and it's not doing too much compared to if you wanted an assault rifle or a different submachine gun to kind of do the same basic job. And yeah, it's kind of okay. Crossbow, which I think this is a regular crossbow. I don't think this is a crossbow. Crossbow's still pretty decent on Survivalist. I'm going to put this one into B tier. Does high damage. It's cheap. You can get basically infinite ammo if you go pick up your bolts every time. Stuns are really common with this thing too, so it's pretty easy to stun Skrakes with it. The Hemogoblin is an odd one. I'm going to put this one actually up into A tier. This weapon is really good by itself, and that's kind of what puts it here. It has an awkward weight, but they've been buffing this one so much with, like, they buffed it so many patches before this, and it's just been good consistently all throughout. It has better healing darts than most of the medic weapons. Its syringes deal damage to enemies, slow them down, and just weaken them over time, which is very nice for the team. You can have extra weight with Survivalist too, which is nice if you want to pair this with something else that's big. It's all around a pretty good weapon if you want to take it as a Survivalist. The double barrel is really good on Survivalist. I'd probably put this one up into A tier, maybe into S tier. It's cheap, it hits really hard. It also doesn't weigh that much, which is nice. And you get extra mobility if you want to fire both barrels and jump up in the air. That's cool. The M16's next. I'd probably put this one up into A tier too. This is one of the better assault rifles to throw onto Survivalist, mostly because it counts as both your level 5s again, so faster reloads on the grenade launcher and the assault rifle. The assault rifle part is solid for clearing up small enemies. Grenade launcher is good for breaking up crowds and dealing some damage to bigger enemies. And it doesn't weigh that much, it only weighs 6, so you can pair it with just about anything else you want. So, solid weapon all the way around. Pulverizer is another really solid weapon for Survivalist. I actually think it's better on Survivalist than it is on Berserker or Demo. I'm going to put this up into A tier. This one you can get faster reloads with, you can also get faster swings with it, and you can get larger explosion radiuses because for whatever reason this one covers 3 of your perks that you can run. It's actually a pretty decent weapon, and it only weighs 6. Again, another very nicely weighted weapon. Dual 500s, another A tier. Very solid option, deals high damage, pretty high damage per second. More difficult to control than like Gunslinger. Same thing goes with the Dual Deagles. They're going up into A tier as well. High damage per second, not very expensive. Upgrades are pretty good, and you can have faster reloads with them. You're not going to be doing as much damage per second as Gunslinger with them, which is why they're not S tier, but they are still very good weapons. Dual 1911s I'm going to put into B tier. They're decent as well because they don't weigh very much. They're not very expensive. They hit fairly hard. Their upgrades honestly aren't that great, but with how fast they reload and how fast you shoot them, they are fairly solid. Dual winter bites are actually really good on Survivalist. I would put them up into A tier. Freezing enemies is always going to be useful, and if you can freeze them and have a cheap weapon and have a lightweight weapon, all of that is really great. The reason why I wouldn't put them into S tier is simply because the Frostfang exists, and I think it's a better option for Survivalists, so I feel like A tier is where they should go. Eviscerator is probably like C tier. It's honestly just kind of okay on Survivalist. If you want to go with a heavy melee setup, this is an okay option because you can still run fast with it and it gives you a ranged option. But it's always felt awkward to me. Fire Axe is another like C tier. It's okay. It's not too heavy and it hits fairly hard, so that is pretty nice. If you want to have something that's like the Croval, but maybe a little bit better, the Fire Axe is probably the better way to go there. And of course, if you're willing to spend money, Medic SMG is probably either A tier or S tier, similar to the Medic Pistol. It doesn't weigh very much. You can heal with it, and it clears up small enemies. All of those things are great. So you can slap this on whatever loadout you want and it's going to do well. Frostfang is easily S tier. It's one of the best weapons in the game, especially on Survivalist, because it counts as a melee weapon so you can run fast when using it. And it's a gun, and it freezes. And if you freeze stuff, you can hit stuff even harder with the Axe Blade, and you can block and parry with it. It kind of just does everything. Up next we have the new weapon, which is the HRG Locust. And the Locust is probably S tier as well. This one's kind of dumb. A weapon that shoots out missiles that don't really do any damage when they direct impact. I think they only do 1 damage whenever they hit something directly. But the explosion damage is pretty high. And then it sends out a swarm of nanobots that eat basically anything around it. This applies a bleeding effect similar to the Hemogoblin, which is really good. And it's just so easy to use this thing. You just spam this into crowds and clear up every small and medium enemy so quick. It doesn't work incredibly well against big enemies like Scrakes and Fleshpounds, but it's not terrible against them. And this thing's also super cheap and doesn't even weigh that much. It actually got nerfed in the beta because it used to be even stronger than this, but it's still really good, especially for the weight and the cost of it. Single Glock 18 is quite good on Survivalist. Single Glock 18 in general is pretty good. I'm going to put this one up into A tier. It's not that expensive. It's basically a submachine gun. So if you want a submachine gun similar to like the MP7, this can be a better option than it because it has a higher rate of fire, slightly larger magazine. MP5 is honestly kind of okay on Survivalist. I'm going to put it into C tier. There's really not a reason to be taking the MP5, but if you do end up getting one, it's not a big deal. It's okay. Again, the MP7's kind of a better option than it just because of how cheap it is and you can start with it and you're going to be using it for the same role. Medic Shotgun is pretty good. I'm going to put this up into A tier. Solid weapon. It does low damage for a shotgun, but it still does shotgun level damage. It's also very accurate. It has a very tight spread, which is nice. The Arc Gen is easily S tier. It does so much damage. It does double damage towards bosses with its secondary fire, and mostly you're just going to be using it for the secondary fire. The secondary fire just clears up any sort of hallway map whatsoever. Incision is pretty decent on Survivalist too. I'm going to put this one up into A tier. It's a medic weapon, but it has piercing darts. It does weigh kind of an awkward amount, and it doesn't hit as hard as some of the Survivalist weapons, but it's still pretty good if you want to be using it both for healing and for damage. The Mag-10 is another C tier weapon. It's cheap and it's lightweight, which is kind of why it's out of D tier. But again, there's not really a reason to be taking it when you can take something like the MP7 or Medic SMG. Kaboom Stick is easy S tier. This thing's S tier by itself, let alone a class that can actually make good use of it. Like Survivalist, it's been insanely strong with it, and it only weighs 6, so it's cheap because it's only a tier 3. It does incredibly high damage. You can't hurt yourself with it. You get extra mobility. It scales incredibly well with upgrades for some reason. It's just all around an amazing weapon, and I don't know why it's never been nerfed. It's basically stayed the same. The Road Redeemer is probably B tier along with the Katana. It's basically the same exact thing as the Katana, just it weighs 1 extra, which makes it worse than the Katana. Maybe I should put it a tier lower. Aside from that, it's exactly the same. It just counts as blunt damage. Drone is really good on Survivalist for some reason. I'm going to put this one up into A tier. It is great to throw these out and just let them hold a zone, and it doesn't mess with your Z time like how it would with Commando. It's actually really good with your Z time if you like taking the stun, because it can just sit there and stun enemies, which is fantastic. And then besides that, it will clear up all the small enemies. Sure, it will aggro big things, but you're playing Survivalist. Survivalist is great at killing big things too. The HRG nail gun is also probably A tier just on its own merits. Yes, you do have some better options than it, but it's still really solid. It still does high damage per second. The piercing is great on it. The Scorcher is sadly not that great on Survivalist because it's a firebug weapon. Survivalist doesn't really have synergy with firebug weapons, So I'm going to put this one into C tier. It's not bad. It does decent damage. The HRG Tesla launcher is probably another C tier. You have better options than this, although it is kind of unique with it having the EMP grenade. So if you want another grenade type, it's not bad for taking that. And if you know you're going to get Patriarch or Matriarch, EMP grenades are really good at disrupting their abilities. The M14 is probably like B tier. It definitely shines more on Sharpshooter than it does on Survivalist Arsenal. Single 1911 is pretty good. I'm going to put this up into A tier. I actually think a single one is better than two, mostly because you can throw it on any loadout, and it's extremely cheap. Doesn't scale well with upgrades, but that's okay because you're usually just throwing this on to pick off small things. You just want something that's cheap, lightweight, and kind of works for that job, and the 1911 works for that job pretty well. Maybe I should actually put this into B tier, in all honesty. Because if I'm going to put one single 1858, the single 1911 should probably be here too. The M32 grenade launcher just weighs too much and costs too much and doesn't do enough damage, really. It's fun to take on Survivalist, but it's probably like a C tier weapon. The M4 is really solid, and I'd put this up into A tier. It gets up there just on its own merits. It does high damage. You can reload it quicker with Survivalist. It's fairly accurate, and it does scale well with upgrades. It's all around just a solid weapon. The M79 grenade launcher is probably like B tier. It's honestly not bad on Survivalist. If you want to go with an explosion build, it's okay. You can clear up crowds with it. The microwave gun is like C tier on Survivalist. Maybe D tier, honestly. Probably like D tier. You're not really going to be taking this on Survivalist. The knockback's okay on its secondary fire. It does decent damage, but it still would scale better with ground fire. Or you could just go with a different explosive weapon if you want to be doing explosions and you don't have to invest the money and the weight to take this, so it's okay. Mine Reconstructor is probably like C tier. It's very situational. Can be good on certain maps. Other maps it's not going to do a whole lot on. It is a healing weapon, so it is pretty nice there. And it was reduced in weight, which is kind of nice, but it's still a little bit of an awkward weight. I want to say it's 7 now. I think it was 8 before. The Mosin on Survivalist is pretty decent. You can block and parry with this. Sadly, this doesn't count as a melee weapon though, so you can't really run faster with it. If you could, it would probably be much higher. Honestly, if you could, it'd be S tier. But right now, it's probably like high B tier, low A tier. Single Rhino is probably like B tier. It's decent. Does decent damage. Bulldog is probably like D tier. There's really no reason to be taking the Bulldog on Survivalist. You can just take a submachine gun that does its job, but better. Something like the Medic SMG is cheap, well, just as cheap as it, plus can heal. Scar, kind of the same thing. Assault rifles don't really shine that well on Survivalist. I'd probably put this one into C tier. It's decent in terms of damage, but for the price that you're paying, you could buy something better than it. The Seal Squeal is really good. I'm going to put this one up into A tier. It does high damage, scales well with upgrades. It's super fun to use. I love the Seal Squeal. The Nail Gun, probably another like A tier or B tier. Probably A tier. Nail Gun's pretty good. It's really cheap. It's your first semi-auto shotgun. It doesn't cost anything to basically buy ammo. You're going to be full on ammo every single match. And it can be even more ammo efficient if you just want to be firing one nail at a time. The Trench Gun is probably another A tier. This is probably one of the best firebug weapons on Survivalist, and just a solid weapon overall. Clears up small things very well, and like most shotguns, it does really high damage at close range. Ground fire is actually pretty nice on it for just clearing up smaller enemies like the clots and the crawlers, or the spiders. The UMP45 is another C tier. Probably never going to take an UMP45. It feels kind of more like an assault rifle than an SMG already, and assault rifles, again, don't necessarily go well with Survivalist, with a few exceptions like the M16. Compound bow is probably like B tier. Honestly, its weight is awkward, and overall the weapon is awkward. It can freeze and it can deal high damage, as well as you can stab with it. Again, this one doesn't count as a melee weapon though, so you don't get faster running speeds with it. It's just kind of awkward. I would much rather have something like the Mosin over this. This is probably on like the low end of B tier, high end of C tier. The Vampire is weird and very awkward, and I think I've only used it like once or twice on Survivalist. I honestly haven't used the Vampire all that much. It's just such an awkward weapon to use. Its secondary fire is really nice, but its primary fire is wonky and just inconsistent to be using as a healing weapon. This is the Heal Thrower, and the Heal Thrower is okay. The Heal Thrower I'd put into B tier. Honestly, it's really, well, it's flat out busted in Medic. And the reason why it's busted on Medic is that you can apply all the buffs from Medic's abilities so quickly with it. You can just apply them with the gas. You can't do that with Survivalist. Its gas is okay for healing, and it's okay for clearing up small things, and it does have healing darts, so it is 2 healing weapons in one, but for its weight, it is a little bit awkward. Dual Spitfires are, they're kind of okay. I'd put them into B tier. You can shoot them fairly quick, you can clear up small things fast. They're not too bad for the price. The Vector is another like B or A tier. It's probably like B tier, honestly. It does okay. but it's kind of pricey for just getting an SMG that you can clear up stuff with. You could go with something like the Glock 18, Medic SMG, MP7, and do the same job, or even the nail gun, and kind of do the same job with it. HZ12 is pretty solid. I'd probably put this one up into A tier. Again, it's cheap, it's a shotgun. Those are really the only two things it needs to be to get up into A tier, and it doesn't weigh that much. That's another thing, I think it only weighs 5. So, yeah, pretty good. Medic AR is also pretty decent. I'm going to put this one into B tier though, because of its weight being a little bit awkward. It's probably on the high end of B tier, low end of A tier. It's a decent assault rifle. It has healing darts on it, which automatically make it good, and it's pretty easy to control. Dual Glock 18s are probably like B tier. They're honestly not as good as just one Glock 18 for the Survivalist. P90 is honestly pretty decent. I'm going to put this one into B tier, but it's also a high B tier, low A tier. It's very cheap. It's only a tier 3 weapon. It holds a lot of shots. It clears up small things. All of that is pretty nice. So it's a good weapon if you just want to use something for clearing up small enemies. The Seeker 6 is probably like C tier. It does decent damage, but it's just kind of awkward to use, and it's an awkward weight, awkward price for Survivalist. Glock 18 with the shield is another like C tier. It's awkward. Its weight is awkward. You can block with it, but why bother when you can just take a melee weapon and block and parry with it? You'll get more use out of that. Even if you wanted to do it with a ranged weapon, something like the Eviscerator might be a better choice. Fire M16 is honestly just kind of okay. It's not that great. I'd put it into B tier, but it's low end of B tier, high C tier. It's not nearly as good as the regular M16. The regular M16 is so much better on Survivalist, again, because you don't really have any synergies with firebug weapons. The HRG Stunner is okay. I'd put this one into B tier. It does decent damage per shot. Single 500 Magnum's probably A tier. That's just a great option. You can buy it early on, it hits really hard, and you can throw it on most loadouts because it only was 3. The new Blood Scythe I was okay with Survivalist. It feels kind of awkward on Survivalist, but it is nice to be able to run around with, and it is cool that it has long reach. So probably like a B tier. The Stoner is probably like C tier. There's not really a reason to be taking the Stoner unless you just want to mow down small enemies, and that's kind of your whole goal. Again, even if you're just doing that, you have better options. Submachine guns tend to work better than the Stoner, or you could just go with something like the Locust now that just clears up hordes so efficiently and so easily. Dual buckshots, probably like C tier as well. There's not really a reason to be buying dual buckshots. They do decent damage. You can reload them fairly quick, but you kind of have better options if you want handguns or if you want shotguns for the same price. Single Winter Bite is probably like B tier. Not as good as 2 of them. It's not very consistent. You want to get to 2 of them, but if you want to buy 1 early on, it's a pretty good option. It's also cheap and lightweight. Zweihander is probably like C tier. It's an awkward weight. It does hit fairly hard, but again, just the awkward weight, and you have better options for melee. The AA-12 is pretty decent. I'd put this one either A tier or S tier. It is heavy, which is unfortunate, but it has nice spread, it has high DPS, large magazine, all of that's pretty good. Killerwatt's probably like B tier. Killerwatt's average to, yeah, probably about average. I was gonna say average to below average, but not really. It's just pretty average overall. It does decent damage, it's expensive to buy. Secondary fire is kind of gimmicky and doesn't really come into play that much, so you're just gonna be using this as kind of a standard assault rifle that shoots out lightning, which is kind of cool. But Helios rifle, another B tier. Okay damage, very pricey. It's good by itself, but again, it's a firebug weapon. It synergizes much better with firebug than it does with Survivalist, so not really the best. RPG is S tier. RPG is so good. Does cost quite a bit and it does weigh quite a bit, but when you're hitting so hard and you're being able to take out Fleshbound so easily, and Scrakes because they're weak to the RPG too. Single 2011 is honestly kind of okay. I'd put this into B tier. It's a single pistol, so it doesn't weigh that much, but it feels awkward on Survivalist. FAL is actually pretty good. I'd put this one up into A tier because this one counts as both a sharpshooter and a commando weapon, so you get faster reloads with it, and that does synergize pretty well with Survivalist. It does decent damage and good damage per second. It is a little bit difficult to control though because of the high rate of fire, or at least the high recoil when you're in full auto. So it's probably on the low end of A tier, high end of B tier. Husk Cannon is like C tier. There's not really a reason to be taking Husk Cannon unless you just want to mess around with it, because you don't really have much synergy with it. It does count as a demo weapon, I guess, so you can have larger explosions, but that's about it. 50 cal is probably another C tier. Even though it's best on Survivalist, it's still more of a meme than anything. It hits really hard, but it weighs so much and costs so much, and it costs so much to buy ammo for, that there's just not really much of a reason to be taking it in the first place. Yes, you can take it, and you can take something like the Kaboom Stick if you just want to like destroy a boss wave or something, but that's kind of the only reason it has to exist. The Meta Grenade Rifle is decent. I'd put this one into B tier. It's expensive and it's kind of heavy, but you do have meta grenades, which are fantastic. That's the main reason why it goes up to B tier. The Assault Rifle part of it's kind of meh. It's not really that great. Flamethrower is probably D tier. This one's basically the same as the Cock and Burn. It has longer range, it has more damage. It's still awful on Survivalist though, because you don't get any synergies with fire, and there's no reason to throw upgrades into this, even if you're playing like Firebug. STG-44 is probably like C tier. There's not really a reason to be grabbing it. It does decent damage per shot, and it's not a bad weapon if you want to take it, but again, submachine guns, pistols, shotguns, the same conversation we've had before. Doomstick is okay. I'm going to put this one into B tier. It's heavy, but it does give you some mobility, and it does get you really high damage per second, and it's a super fun weapon to use. Static Strikers are just kind of meh on Survivalist in my opinion. I don't really use them. I don't particularly care for them in the first place, but they're an okay melee weapon if you want to take them. I just feel like there's better options that you could go with for melee. AK is another like C tier. You don't really need to be buying like a tier 3 assault rifle. The M16 would be a better option anyway on Survivalist. AK is pretty good by itself on like Commando, but that's when you're using like 3-round burst and you're taking advantage of all the recoil reduction that you have there. You don't have that with Survivalist, so it's still going to kick around a decent amount and it feels really awkward. The Disruptor is probably another like C tier, or maybe it's a B tier weapon. It's honestly really lightweight. It does decent damage per shot. Its secondary fire is unique but kind of gimmicky. Dual Rhinos, probably like C tier. There's not really a reason to be taking Dual Rhinos. They're okay. They do decent damage. They have decent range, but again, kind of get outcompeted by other stuff. Tommy Boom is honestly not bad on Survivalist. I'd put this one up into B tier, mostly because you can have larger explosions with it, which does help against dense crowds. It's also just okay in general to clear up small enemies, but it's going to be one of those things that you buy early on and then probably sell, so low B tier, high C tier. FAMAS with the Master Key is probably B tier as well. Honestly, this one's kind of awkward, but its weight is okay, and the fact that you can have faster reloads with either part of it is nice. It's just, it's always been an awkward... Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to put this into C tier. It's always been an awkward weapon. The Hemoclobber is easily S tier. It's one of the best melee weapons in the game. Survivalist can take advantage of that. You can also heal with it, and you can even take the bigger explosion perk, because the secondary fire when you hit with a heavy attack also counts for explosions, at least explosion radius. Bastion is not bad, honestly. Bastion's pretty decent if you want to tank with it. I think I'm going to put it up into A tier. It's on the low end of A tier, though, because it is still expensive and it's still an awkward weight. But it does do quite a bit, because you have a shield with it that you can just flip up and down. You could argue that that's really not necessary with Survivalist, because you could take a melee weapon and block and parry all the same. Fair, but if you want to be shooting small stuff with this, it's not a bad option either, because you can still take it with another big weapon if you want to take it like Seal Squeal or M4 or whatever. Blast Brawlers do decent damage, and they've actually been buffed. They feel a lot better on Survivalist. They feel a lot better overall, and they're already pretty decent on Survivalist. I'm going to put this one high up into B tier, maybe bordering on A tier, which is something I never thought I'd say with these weapons. But since they've got faster animations now, they feel much better. You can still block and parry with them, and they give you ranged options, which is pretty good. So decent all the way around. Thermite Bore is probably B tier just by itself, because it does so much damage, but there's no real reason to take it on Survivalist just because it doesn't synergize well. It's another Firebug weapon. Amazing on Firebug, not that great on Survivalist. Railgun is probably A tier. It does really high damage. It's just that it's kind of expensive. It's a better option than something like the 50 cal, because with the 50 cal you're just usually overkilling things and paying a premium price for it. Railgun, you're not paying so much, and it still kills big things really efficiently. Single buckshot is pretty decent. Better than 2 buckshots, I'd say. It's lightweight, it's cheap, does decent damage at close range and even at medium range, so yeah, not bad. Bone Crusher is probably like B tier, mostly because you can defend so well with it, and it also is a melee weapon, so that's a bonus. Minigun is like C tier. It's honestly probably better on Survivalist than it is on any other class, but it's still not great on any other class. Even after they've buffed it, it still is awkward. Its weight is still weird. Corruptor Carbine's pretty good. Corruptor Carbine's probably like an A tier. Medic weapon, it is a difficult to use medic weapon, but it is a medic weapon, so that is really nice, and the damage on it is pretty legit. It hits really hard per shot, so even if you just want to use it as a sniper rifle, it's a pretty good option there. Single Piranha pistol is pretty good as well. I'd probably put this one up into A tier. You can block and parry with it, which is its main advantage, and it does high damage. Same thing goes with the 2 Piranha pistols. High damage, block and parry with them. That's pretty nice. Gravity Imploder is kind of awkward. I'd probably put this one into C tier, mostly from the weight. You can have better explosions than this. It's still a fun weapon to use, but it's a little bit awkward. Beluga Beat is probably like B tier. It's honestly pretty good for stun locking stuff. If you want to stun lock anything big like Scrags, Flesh Pounds, bosses, and just kind of abuse them that way, it works. So don't throw upgrades into it and just use it for that option. It pairs well with melee weapons too, weirdly enough, but it is kind of a fun weapon to use. HRG Crossboom is really good. I'd put this one up into A tier. Solid all-around option. It's actually far better on Survivalist than it is on Demo, in my opinion, where it doesn't weigh that much, and it has pretty consistent stuns on it. It also benefits from the larger explosion radius, which is nice because with its secondary fire, it has a pretty big explosion radius. Ion Thruster is probably like B tier. It's honestly pretty decent on Survivalist, it's just that it's expensive, and you could go with something like the Hemoclobber if you just want a melee weapon to block and parry with, but if you want a dedicated melee weapon that you're killing stuff with, the Ion Thruster is probably one of your best options. Battle Axe is like another C or D tier, honestly. Similar to the minigun, it just weighs too much. It swings slow, it weighs too much. Yes, you can move faster with it, but at 10 weight, what's the point? You could just take the Crovel. The Crovel would be far better than this for the same job that you're going to be using it for. The Headhunter is an awkward weapon, but honestly, it's better on Survivalist than on most classes, and I'd put it up into B tier because at least swelling the head of enemies and stunning enemies is useful. It's just that you're going to be taking this for a supportive role, and it's just really awkward that this is on Sharpshooter for all classes. Reducto Ray is another weird weapon that I'd probably say is B tier. It's situationally good. You can kill a decent amount of things, and it does actually help against certain bosses, although it can also hurt you against certain bosses, like the King Fleshpound. If you make him smaller and he uses a chest laser, you can't duck underneath it, and he'll just destroy you that way. The new G36 is pretty decent on Survivalist, in all honesty. Probably like B tier still. It's mostly its weight and its price, because you're basically buying an assault rifle that can pierce through multiple things, which is really nice, but it's still a little bit awkward for the price, and if you wanted something like this, you could still get better options than it. If you want something for clearing up small things, submachine guns again. If you want stuff for clearing up big things, shotguns or demo weapons or rifles. Dragon's Blaze is another weird one. It's honestly probably like B tier. Again, it doesn't really have synergies since it is a firebug weapon. Maybe I'd put this into C tier in all honesty. It's probably like high C tier, low B tier. It does good damage per shot, which is kind of surprising because I figured it'd be less than that for Firebug, but it does good damage per shot. It's just the fire doesn't really help you that much as Survivalist. It's good for clearing up small things, but that's about it. Dosh Gun, I forgot I put this one on here. Dosh Gun is dependent on the map and dependent on the gameplay that you're doing. If you're doing Endless, it can be pretty decent. If you're buying it early on, it can be decent. If you have excess money, it can be decent. And I think it's actually going to get buffed in the next patch, so it's probably actually going to be higher than this. But for right now, it's pretty meh on Survivalist. Dual 2011s, C tier. I've rarely taken Dual 2011s with Survivalist. Maybe B tier. They're okay at dealing damage. They deal pretty decent damage per second, but mostly you're taking these to get like rack 'em up stacks with Gunslinger, which is where they really shine. And on Survivalist, they really don't. I would rather have something like the Deagles or the 500s over these. Then we have the Centerfire. Centerfire is probably S tier. It is really good. It's very cheap. It does really high damage. It scales really well with upgrades, and you get faster reloads with it regardless. It also only weighs 5, and its base damage is crazy. It does like 165 damage per shot. And then a single Spitfire. Single Spitfire is probably like B tier. It's okay. You get faster reloads with it. It's good for clearing up small things, and it makes for a decent weapon if you don't have a whole lot of money. So I think this is all the weapons in Killing Floor. I could be wrong about that. I might have missed one or two of them, and if so, I do apologize for that. As you can see, Survivalist has a big variety of stuff. There's honestly not a whole lot of terrible things to be using with Survivalist. Most of the weapons are good. It's just that some of the weapons get outcompeted by other ones in a same or similar role. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thanks so much for sitting through it. I really do appreciate it. Special thanks to the supporters of this channel. These are my members over here on YouTube, patrons over on Patreon. They get early access to videos just like this, and if you'd like to be part of it, you can. There are links in the description. Thanks everybody for doing that. I really do appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye!